Hi, everyone. Welcome to Identity Crisis, a show from the Shalom Hartman Institute creating better conversations about the issues facing Jewish life. I'm Yehuda Kurtzer. We're recording on Thursday, January 9th, 2025. One of my favorite questions to think about, the core question animating this book that I am trying and failing to devote time to writing, is the question of whether America is diaspora. Now, in the literal sense, sure, America is one of the places Jews have lived outside the land of Israel that constitute the places of our dispersions. At a critical moment in our history, a long time ago, our people found a way to sustain group identity in a way that was different than many other ethnic groups connected to tribal lands. We insisted that we remain the people of Judea, and over time, just Jews, even without living there. We could live anywhere and be of that place and dream of the promised land, knowing that we'd never actually step foot in it. In that sense, sure, American Jews came to America hundreds of years ago as part of our dispersions, and its story, the story of American Jews, is just one piece of the great exilic, diasporic story of our people. Even so, I like to argue, even just as a thought experiment, that since 1948, maybe that category no longer fully applies to American Jews. After all, the premise of exile was that Jews couldn't go back to their homeland. Now, and in America more than any other diaspora Jewish community, many of whom did return to the land of Israel, this diaspora community here in America became something different, a place for Jews of a voluntary choice. So the old category doesn't seem to work so well. There are some who argue that not only is Zion not the promised land, but that America is actually the promised land. The Jewish historian Jacob Neusner wrote as much in the Washington Post in 1987, saying, quote, "If there ever was a promised land, we Jewish Americans are living in it." I don't go so far. I don't think our loyalties to America or to Israel are zero-sum. I don't think we have to choose between a promised land and the place that we choose to live. But America does force us to consider whether categories of Jewish behaviors from our exilic past really map effectively onto the story of what we're doing here, whether it helps us or hurts us to process the American present, even through that very prism of diaspora. So consider, as an example, a classic take on pre-modern exilic Jewish politics. The historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who I had the pleasure of taking classes from when I was a student at Columbia, is well known among scholars for many reasons, but famously for an argument he makes describing the bulk of Jewish diaspora politics as, quote, the royal alliance. This means Jews built their relationships intentionally with monarchs whenever they could. As Yerushalmi says in a famous talk entitled Servants of God and Not Servants of Servants, quote, Jews seem to have discovered early in their experience of exile that their ultimate safety and welfare could be entrusted neither to the erratic benevolence of their Gentile neighbors nor to the caprice of local authorities. The Jewish gravitation towards vertical alliances was, if not inevitable, at least thoroughly realistic. This doesn't always work out so well, and it didn't always throughout Jewish history. If a new king arises, as the book of Exodus eerily predicts, one who does not know Joseph, or in the medieval version, doesn't know or like the Jews who were so closely tied to his predecessor, there can be retributive consequences for the Jews of that original alliance. Also, some critics have argued that this choice of allying with the king makes it very difficult for Jews to self-organize in the face of threats. But choosing the royal alliance for Jews was the inevitable result of having to make a difficult choice out of a set of bad options. This form of politics, in other words, was an attempt to grasp at safety from a place of fundamental powerlessness. So now let's go back to our question. Is America part of that history and story? We American Jews see our story here interlaced with the political framework of liberal democracy. America is blessedly kingless. That was actually kind of part of the point, which means we couldn't build a formal royal alliance strategy if we wanted to. But that doesn't mean that Jewish dispositions or biases about politics necessarily change. Michael Walzer puts this well, that the existence of liberal democratic America and a Jewish sovereign state can end the formal diasporic conditions of the Jewish past, but they only make possible, they cannot guarantee, he says, our release from the politics of exile. Does the fact that we live in a totally different political framework mean that American Jews have a different politics than our diasporic ancestors? Or have we inherited their instincts and biases into our politics as well today? Are we still diaspora Jews, whether or not we face the same diaspora conditions of our ancestors? There's a lot to say about this. I have a lot of questions. I think a lot about how diaspora politics continue to debilitate, in my view, moral leadership in Israel and debilitate what I find to be a lot of American Jewish establishment politics. But most importantly, it's the eve of a presidential inauguration here in America, and the president being inaugurated seems to think of himself in more royal terms than most of his predecessors. In fact, I read this week that the planned inauguration is the most expensive anticipated in history. I thought it would be a fascinating angle to consider the history and the story of how Jews relate to the American presidency. Are we, in fact, the inheritors of a royal alliance in our politics here, mapped onto our version of democratic governance? Or are we doing something different? What are American Jewish politics, in other words, as they relate to the American presidency? To help work this out, I'm joined today by a teacher and a friend, the Dean of American Jewish Historians, Jonathan Sarna, University Professor and the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. Professor Sarna was chief historian for the 350th commemoration of the American Jewish community, is recognized as the leading commentator on American Jewish history, religion, and life. In 2009, elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I will also say, on a personal level, my first employer for a job right out of graduate school. When I got to be temporarily a professor at Brandeis, I got to work closely with Jonathan and learned from him throughout that experience. So thank you for coming on the show, Professor Sarna, or Jonathan, if I may.
It is a pleasure to be with you, President Kurtzer, or Yehuda, if I may.
Yeah, that's another royal alliance. Let's start with the hypothesis that I've laid out. Do you think that, broadly speaking, there are elements of the American Jewish relationship to the presidency that follow this notion of a royal alliance? Or is this just totally such a different structure that we have to think about American Jewish politics totally differently?
I think there are many continuities. There is a kind of interesting proof of it, which is that while in the 19th century, Jewish prayers for the United States government were new prayers. They didn't emulate the traditional prayer, which begins, "He who gives dominion to kings." But in the 20th century, Orthodox congregations, many to this day, recite a prayer that begins, "He who gives dominion to kings." Now, of course, that's a quote from the book of Psalms, but nevertheless, it's very revealing. But as a student of American Jewish politics, it's also clear to me that at least from the time of Abraham Lincoln, Jews looked to the powerful president to save them. When Ulysses S. Grant expels Jews from his large war zone, they go straight to Abraham Lincoln, and lo and behold, Abraham Lincoln overturns Ulysses S. Grant's order and tells Jews just what they wanted to hear, that he doesn't like to hear any group or race maligned on account of a few sinners. And after that, more and more, with ups and downs, we see Jews aligning themselves with presidents. When U.S. Grant himself becomes president, a lot of Jews had questions at that time in 1868, but Grant, for the first time, has a Jewish advisor who, in a sense, runs interference between the Jewish community and Grant. His name was Simon Wolf, and it's very significant to look at his memoir, which is entitled Presidents I Have Known, not politicians I have known, presidents I have known. And when Wolf passes from the scene, you can certainly still see Jews looking to the president. And as some will know, when President Taft was reluctant to abrogate a treaty with Russia, something Jews wanted him to do to punish Russia for its early 20th century pogroms. Jews abandoned Taft and punish him and really shift away. And of course, in 1912, a lot of Jews are going to shift over to Woodrow Wilson, and if not Wilson, to Theodore Roosevelt, showing that this alliance requires both sides. And I think that has continued. And of course, as more and more East European Jews become citizens, learn about American politics, come to realize that the Socialist Party is a dead end, Franklin Delano Roosevelt mesmerizes the Jewish community. 90% of Jews voted for Roosevelt in at least one of his elections. Amazing that 90% of Jews agreed on anything.
Can't agree whether it's raining. Yeah.
But they agreed on that. And even the jokes about that alliance are interesting. The Jews, it works better in Yiddish, believe in three worlds. They believe in this world, diese Welt. They believe in the next world, jene Welt. And they believe in Roosevelt, almost linking him in that way. And when you move beyond Roosevelt, Jews felt Truman was the central figure in ensuring a Jewish state. It's hard to remember that Jews in America really felt that they had helped to create that state. There were millions of DPs. America didn't want to admit them. And here Jews work with the administration, overcome the State Department in the Jewish myth, thanks to Truman's old partner, Eddie Jacobson. And lo and behold, the state comes into existence. And Truman's sense that he was Cyrus, as he said. That's a quote from Truman, "I am Cyrus." Well, that gives you a sense of the link of past and present. And just as lots of Jews did not return to the Promised Land, but stayed in Persia or went to Babylon, to my mind, what's really interesting today is that for the first time in more than 1,000 years, we really have two centers of Jewish life, America and Israel. And the next time people look, it'll be clear 90% of the world's Jews are in either the one or the other, about equal parts. You can quibble depending on who you count as a Jew, but it's equally U.S. and Israel, a lot of back and forth between those two. But the rest of the diaspora, which was alive and well in 1939 and even in the immediate aftermath of World War II, is finished or declining and seems to show not a lot of hope of resuscitating. That's a whole new world.
So you gave us a lot in terms of a survey. I'm going to want to dive into a whole bunch of pieces of that. But let me go back to the core question, which is, it seems to me that in your survey, you are kind of affirming that in some ways, the special relationship that American Jews cultivate over the century that you talked about, really from Lincoln all the way through Truman, is kind of a special relationship with the presidency and an understanding that you may be living in a framework that's very different than kings and nobles, but that the president has a unique role to play and can be both admired and appreciated for playing that special role on behalf of Jews and also criticized and abandoned. But that second piece, which is criticized and abandoned, feels like a pretty big shift than most of the experience of Jews in the Royal Alliance, because if your fates are intertwined with the king, then the king not acting on your behalf does not allow you to simply say, well, we'll choose the next guy. What you actually have to do is continue to curry favor with the king and try to get the evil decree reversed. There are just legendary stories in the Talmud about exactly this. How do we burrow our way in, make sure that the evil decree can get reversed? So interestingly, it sounds as though Jews are still carrying this kind of collective orientation towards the king in the president, but with a very different relationship to the power they wield in relationship to the president, that if they're disappointed, hey, we can turn and vote for a different guy instead. That suggests that there's something different about this than the previous history of diaspora politics.
I think that's largely true. I would point out that in Russia, under the last of the czars, there were lots of Jews who either joined revolutionary parties or even, and this is true of that prayer for the government as well, in kind of secretive ways were critical, meaning they used coded language which revealed what they really thought. You can sometimes see that in Russian prayer books, where in big letters they pray for the Tsar. In microscopic letters, there's a kind of explanation. In one of them, it points out, we also prayed for Nebuchadnezzar, which of course is a clever way of saying exactly who they thought Tsar Nicholas resembled. Mm-hmm. But I do think you're absolutely right that Jews in the United States have felt a lot freer to be critical. On the other hand, they've been nervous about the idea that either party should imagine Jews don't matter. And that's why, really, for many years, you have found Jews on both sides. Even though the vote may have been heavily Democratic, you had wealthy Jews, famously Max Fisher, who talked about it in his autobiography. I think there should be Jewish supporters of the Republican Party. And at the time of the Yom Kippur War, when Max Fisher went to see Richard Nixon, a lot of people were glad that there was a kind of court Jew, note that medieval term, who could go and speak to Richard Nixon and save Israel, again, the way that was remembered. So it's fascinating to see the interplay of old ideas with new realities.
So going back to the first point that you made about the shift in the history of this prayer, which I find really interesting, I see that, I experience it anecdotally, go to different synagogues. I like paying attention to the nusach, the liturgy that different synagogues use for the prayer for the United States. It's interesting to note that the prayer for the state of Israel is nearly universal across different synagogues. Sometimes in conservative synagogues, it is ended earlier. In Orthodox synagogues, it goes longer. Very, very rarely in very progressive synagogues, you'll find a different version of a prayer for Israel, which is more about a prayer for peace, but you're talking marginal. But there's wide variation on what kind of prayer people say for the United States. And it's worth noting that in synagogues that pray primarily in English, the contentiousness around American politics makes that prayer particularly vexed right now because people understand what you're saying. Like if you mutter it in Hebrew, then okay, fine, it's part of the liturgy. When you say it in English and people can actually think, wait, am I really praying for this Justice Department? Then it creates the whole question around prayer and sincerity of like, I don't want to pray for this government, or yeah, in other words, that's a whole piece of the story as well. But why is it that, as you suggested earlier in the 19th century, American Jews were not using the kind of royal prayer? Why does it come back? Is that because earlier iterations of American Jews are buying into being citizens of a liberal democracy with a little bit less of a corporate identity? In other words, why does the royal story of the presidency rise for American Jews in the 19th century? It seems like it should go in reverse.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Well, first of all, the imperial presidency has grown. George Washington was very opposed to being treated in any way like a king. The first question was, how do we address the President of the United States?
Mm-hmm.
And there were people who said, well, let's follow the Dutch and call him His High Mightiness, which is not the same as Your Majesty, but certainly puts him on a pedestal. We've had a few presidents who would have liked that title. But Washington absolutely refused, and we say Mr. President and the President of the United States. We do it reflexively, but that was a revolution.
Mm.
And if you look at the earliest 19th century American prayer books, they only pray for the legislature when they are in session. Otherwise, they're citizens just like us. And they were very aware that they were in a different country. And then two things happened. First of all, in the Civil War, Washington and the presidency really rises up. Lincoln is a very central figure. And following Lincoln, other presidents inherited that mantle. Zev Elef has argued that the central rabbis who we begin to see in the second half of the 19th century are in some respects an emulation of the central government. And you're not afraid of that kind of power. But of course, when East European Jews came to America, they had no memory of the American Revolution, hardly knew about it, and they reflexively used the very same prayers for America, and aiding that was actually printing, because a lot of them brought European prayer books and just would rip out a page and replace it. So they brought back many of the familiar relationships, and you can easily point to leading Orthodox rabbis who gloried in their ties to the president. Think Eliezer Silver, one of the greatest Orthodox rabbis of his day prior to World War II, and how close he is to the Taft family and how he saw that as beneficial. He even wrote a book in Yiddish, which was clearly designed to persuade Jews to vote for various Tafts because they were so righteous. Of course, that continues with FDR, who is revered in a way more similar to the way Jews liked benevolent leaders, say Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, whom Jews loved. My grandmother called him Ephraim Yossel, which nobody ever would have referred to a czar that way. But Roosevelt, Jews thought of as one of their own. And when he dies, he's mourned in that way. There's a whole book about Jews mourning Roosevelt.
First of all, I want to ask, does this experience of Jews fashioning our public political identity as a minority ethnic group or religious group in relationship to the rise of the imperial presidency, do you see that mirrored among other American groups? It's always a question to me about American Jewish history is, I think it's an Isaiah Berlin line, maybe. Jews are just like everybody else, but more so. Is this just a set of behaviors that we are interested in because of our attachments in Jewish life, or is this actually a trend that can be studied simply by comparing American Jews to the way other Americans are relating towards the presidency?
So I don't want to pretend that I've looked at the political behavior of every group, but I tend to think that Jews certainly are more than others and have organized in particular ways more than others. Once the Irish certainly had a very rich political tradition in America, and a lot of them used it to move up in politics. But most places that has declined as the Irish just became white folks, as the book said.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Jews, I think it has continued. I tend to think that others have learned from Jews about ethnic politics, and I certainly think it's easy to show how Muslim and Arab Americans have looked to the Jewish model. CARE once had a different name. It was the Arab American Anti-Defamation League. Well, where did that name come from?
Yeah.
And when one talks to Muslim scholars, they are well aware that the minority group that is a kind of reference point are the Jews, and indeed there was a certain desire to outdo them in the public square, and after October 7th, it may turn out that that was successful, all those years of planning. But I do think that Jews invented in some aspects of what they did, which is really a combination of three parts. Number one, the accidental fact that Jews have long lived in states that are absolutely crucial to someone who wants to be president. In other words, they didn't create the Electoral College, but they benefited from it. Number two, simply the Jewish vote. And number three, less comfortable to talk about, Jewish donations to political parties. And what's so interesting about the man I spoke about earlier, Max Fisher, is that the Fishers gave enough to the Republican Party that they had to be taken very seriously. They were listened to. So even though that was an era when not so many Jews voted Republican, Richard Nixon, I don't think he got even 20%, and he knew the Jews don't vote for him. Nevertheless, they couldn't ignore Jews altogether for that reason. And those three pieces, where Jews live, who they vote for, and their donations, are still the basis of Jewish politics. Certainly in the United States, no group is so disproportionately involved in funding the two parties as Jews are. And those are public, and anyone can see that. So Jews are disproportionately important in their material support for the parties.
Yeah, it's hard to, you said it's uncomfortable to talk about because it's when you say it out loud, those who would want to weaponize that kind of language would talk about Jewish conspiratorial power as opposed to simply a group that is trying to use whatever levers and tools are at its disposal to ensure its own safety and guarantee its own interests. That's just what politics is. I felt this acutely a few weeks ago. I was a guest at the White House Hanukkah party, and the gathering there feels, I don't know, there's something on one hand that feels very unique in, and I always, whenever I'm there, I kind of whisper Shechianu the whole time, a feeling like in the presence of a story of acceptance and arrival that American Jews experience by being invited in this way and showing up in, you have like the Navy choir singing Hanukkah songs and the president is serving latkes. The whole thing is wild, but there's something at the same time very traditional about the fact that like the folks who are there are folks. Sometimes you have like Jewish organizational leaders like me who don't really work with the administration, but the staffers, I think, listen to the podcast. Then you have actual Jewish organizational leaders who work closely with the administration on priorities, but by far the biggest sector are folks who are donors to the Democratic Party or to the president's reelection campaign. And these are just indicators of levers of power that the Jewish community reflects. And there's something just a little bit awe-inspiring and a little bit very realistic about seeing that transaction of power and money in the presidency so transparently and publicly on display. I want to go to the flip side, the dark side of Royal Alliance politics for Jews, which is what happens when the Jewish community perceives that a president is not their friend in office, but potentially has disproportionate power to do bad things for Jews. And this was the kind of alarmism that arose back in 2015, 2016 in the first Trump campaign. President Trump, even for those I think who like and support President Trump, would have to acknowledge his predilection for authoritarianism in his behaviors, in his speech, the way he goes after his political opponents, his use of a framework of the state is me, right? That is very essential to Trump's leadership. And so it was not surprising to have many Jews encode the rise of Trump as the rise of a king who has the potential to do very bad things to us. And that led to, most commonly, people don't cite 11th and 12th century monarchs. They cite 20th century fascist dictators. But you wrote back in 2016, I believe, that the better analogy for American Jews to think about in terms of the Trump presidency was not Hitler, it was Warren Harding. Can you talk about that a little bit and what context you were trying to provide to American Jews in a moment like that as relates to this question of what to be concerned about?
Yeah, we forget often when we think that the central issue is Israel, that before the central issue was Israel, the central issue was free immigration. Can suffering Jews get to America? And the victory of Warren Harding and a Republican Party that was committed to banning immigration was that America's gates were going to be closed. And indeed, 1924, we see that happen. And you had a time previously that more than 100,000 Jews were coming annually. After the Johnson Act is passed, that number drops to 10,000 and change. And we know what that meant. In the 1930s, there was nowhere for Jews who needed to escape, nowhere to go. The Harding era is also an era of very substantial anti-Semitism. In other words, the condition for Jews in America got worse rather than better. That should sound familiar, but those are always very difficult moments for Jews. Henry Ford, the international Jew, and Ford was the equivalent in his day of some of the mega wealthy tech barons of today, and his battle against Jews certainly spooked the Jewish community. Nevertheless, although the 20s and 30s were hard years, they certainly were not what happened in Germany. And from a progressive view, almost a Whiggish view of American history, well, all right, there were bumps in the road, but then we moved closer and closer to the kind of America that we hoped would come into being. And after World War II, you have decades when anti-Semitism declines and Jews believe that America is becoming more pluralistic, and they're very optimistic until our day, when once again that goes down. But my point in the article was that we can use American analogies, and they don't necessarily lead us to the Holocaust. They may lead us to moments of difficulty and change. And I think that would be more true if you were an Asian. You would remember the horrors inflicted upon Japanese Americans in World War II, but then it ended. And since then, things have been a lot better for them. Asian Americans have seen very significant success. The model minority, which would have been unimaginable in the 1940s. So that's a more hopeful way of thinking about America and using American analogies. But the truth is, although we never teach it, that there were certainly Jews who believed, we can work with this Hitler guy. We have prayers for Hitler. We have Jewish organizational letters to Hitler. And we know perfectly well that there were very famous German Jews, including Albert Einstein, who initially thought, this too will pass. The point is, history doesn't give us clear examples, and you can point in the 20th century to a variety of lessons. It seemed to me, and I still think so, that the American example of the interwar years was a better example. And as things have developed since I wrote that piece, and we see the explosion of anti-Semitism, we see college campuses that turn on Jews, and so on, well, all of that would have been familiar to Jews in the 20s and 30s, and their job was to find workarounds. They won't let us here. We'll build something there. Maybe eventually we'll build our own university, and we'll call it Brandeis, and it will have no quotas. Yeah. And so on and so forth. But that strategy allowed Jews to survive the bad years and then to thrive in the good years. And as I say, I think we're seeing a return in some respects to some of those strategies as Jews find themselves shut out from various places where once they had been admitted, just like their great-great-grandparents were shut out from clubs and schools that had admitted them in the 19th century. The Union Club was created by Jews and then refused to admit them. They worked around it and bided their time. And I think that's really the more likely scenario here in the United States, and learning from American Jewish history rather than just focusing on the Holocaust lessons would, I think, be a good thing.
I guess the challenge with the analogy that I'm struggling with is what feels a little bit like a double bind for liberal Jews, which is if you would follow the pattern of who protects us and appeal back to that notion of let me curry favor with a royal figure who cares about protecting and defending the Jews from their neighbors and from, et cetera, that to me helps understand the growing appeal of more Jews than I would have expected to a Trump presidency, because he speaks in a language of support, a certain kind of naked support for Israel, a kind of opposition to anti-Semitism, no hemming and hawing, an attack on the universities because of the anti-Semitism against Jews. So on one hand, you have that. On the other hand, whereas in the 1920s and 30s, anti-immigrant fervor was directed at Jews as well as other immigrants, now Jews, by not being part of the immigrant class, may have, from the standpoint of their Jewish values, an opposition to anti-immigrant fervor, but it's no longer in the Jewish interests. So now you have, in ways that are different, opposite from the 30s, Jewish values and Jewish interests are actually being pulled against one another. And I think that creates a certain type of crisis for American liberal Jews. I take the viewpoint that I find no appeal to Trump to protect the Jews, largely because I don't put my faith in presidents. I put my faith in liberal democratic systems. And I would rather not have special protection by executive order. I would rather do the hard work of rebuilding trust in institutions that includes building systems that actually repel authoritarian power. But it does feel like we're in a different place in American Jewish group identity than any of the historical precedents enable us to understand.
I certainly think in terms of immigration, that is the case. The opponents of immigration argued, all of these minorities, the Jews, the Catholics, they're changing America. By the way, that was correct.
Yeah.
Their goal in 1924, it's well in the record in the debate, was to turn the clock back to 1890. So that's why England had a big quota and Germany had quite a large quota, Eastern Europe and Italy very small quotas. And the hope was that we would restore America to the good old days. Of course, that didn't happen. It was ridiculous. And America emerged a very different country. Now, Jews were happy about that. And indeed, Jews contributed to it. Ethnic pluralism rather than Christian America, a Protestant Catholic Jew. Let's remake America in a way that makes Jews insiders. Well, of course, the situation since immigration reform in the 60s is totally different. Now, again, we have a new America being shaped before our eyes, but the newcomers who have come in are heavily people of color, and a goodly percentage of them are Muslims. And indeed, I think it is correct. The Jews are very worried that this country that made them insiders and in which they felt so very comfortable suddenly is being remade by newcomers, immigrants, people who were not here at all in the days of John F. Kennedy. Now, I know people who in the Jewish community who say, and I think recently Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL said, we're going to have to rethink some of our policies because we do have interests as Jews, and we'd be very foolish to ignore those interests. Others would argue what could be more of a Jewish value than allowing all sorts of people to come into the United States, the tired, the poor. We wrote those lines.
Yep.
And how can we not allow them in? I remind you, though, that the man who the president has tapped is also Jewish, who's supposed to secure those borders. I think there is today a debate in the Jewish community between those who emphasize more our interests and those who hearken to traditional American Jewish values. And that's probably why, whereas, Barry Goldwater got 10% of the Jewish vote, Donald Trump has probably got a third of the Jewish vote. Those show you some of those differences. There's also a new power, which we don't always think about, but the Chabad movement has long believed, even in Russia, that working with leaders is very important, and that's certainly been the politics of Chabad in the United States. It probably explains why America put itself out to help save the Rebbe. When he had come in 29, he had forged, the previous Rebbe, Joseph Schneerson, had forged ties, including with the president, and that saved his life. And what we have seen, and it directly relates to that Hanukkah party you talked about, that was all Chabad, meaning the Hanukkah menorah that Jimmy Carter, now the late Jimmy Carter, was the first to light a Hanukkah menorah. He went out of the White House. Then they brought the Hanukkah menorah into the White House. Then Mr. Bush, who had a faith-based initiative, wanted to put the Christ back into Christmas. So he couldn't invite Jews. So he makes a separate Hanukkah party. And then they give over to Chabad, the making that party kosher. Chabad has always been important in that story of the Jewish religion in the public square. And Chabad has very successfully worked with presidents on both parties. And that has created a somewhat different politics. And even though in terms of sheer numbers, the Chabad organization is not large, in terms of its influence and what it's accomplished, most of us cannot begin to think even about how much they have changed the political landscape.
Sure. I have a lot of holy envy of Chabad in that respect. And I would say, to the original point, I'm very much on team Emma Lazarus. And I identify with the way that Hayas now use the phrase that Hayas, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, talks about their work, is they said, we used to advocate on behalf of immigrants because they were Jews. Now we do so because we are Jews, right? But what I appreciate about what you're pushing us towards is that it's better when that conversation is more transparent about the fact that it relates to how much we are actually willing to allow America to be different as a result of immigration. And to be honest, if you actually want to advocate on behalf of Jewish values for more open borders, you are also tolerating the possibility that some dimensions of the American story will change. And some of us would say, well, that's inevitably the case, and others would want to resist it. Let me ask you one last question, which is the Jewish president. This has been two conversations over the past couple of decades. One, the very literal version, which is, when are we going to have a Jewish president? It almost feels like a banal topic now, because once you have multiple candidates from different parties, Lieberman, Sanders, Bloomberg, Trump with Jewish grandchildren, Clinton and Jewish grandchildren, it almost feels like it's not really a question anymore. It may happen at some point, but maybe it will not be as big of a deal in some earth-shattering way as we might have thought it to be. But on the other hand, there's also terms that you used, you referenced Roosevelt earlier. I remember when Obama was running, he was talked about by some as the first Jewish president, conveying something about his identity that wasn't about being Jewish, but it was about understanding the Jewish people or representing the Jewish people in some way. That was not universally held about Obama. I'm curious what you think the future of the very conversation about the Jewish president will look like.
Well, first of all, we should know that that's the oldest myth that you can find after the revolution. There's a speech given at an orphanage in Charleston, and the speech reminds those orphans, in America, you can be president. And Jews were deeply proud of the fact that they lived in a country where Jew could be president, and it was conscious, meaning the founders themselves said, well, if you find a worthy person, if they happen to be Jewish and everyone votes for them, that's what democracy is about. The amazing thing is that almost everybody would have imagined that the order would have been a woman president, a Jewish president, and a black president, and that's not what happened. Mm-hmm. A reminder that life doesn't always follow the imagined patterns. This business of a president being Jewish, all the presidents the Jews liked, they imagined must secretly be Jewish. Roosevelt, Roosevelt, some said Truman was Jewish. There's a whole literature about Johnson, but in a way that suggests, well, if they didn't have a Jewish gene, they would have been anti-Semites like all non-Jews. The only explanation is, must be a Jew. I reject that, I have to say. But like you, I think that the fact that we have not had a Jewish president should not obscure the amazing fact, that being Jewish is not an impediment today. We know that Joe Lieberman actually brought votes rather than lost them. And as you point out, all of the recent presidents have boasted about their Jewish grandchildren. And that's really quite astonishing. And you can really look at the different groups of grandchildren and learn a lot about the possible impacts of intermarriage. Trump's are Orthodox Jews, Bernie Sanders are all Christian, and the Clinton grandchildren are being raised in two faiths. Between the grandchildren, they follow the spectrum. But I think it likely will happen someday. But even Goldwater, after all, was of Jewish descent, leading to Harry Golden's famous quip, "I always knew that the first Jewish president would be an Episcopalian." And I tend to think that people in politics imagine that, at least prior to October 7th, that being Jewish is beneficial. The first time where we have seen that questioned was actually when the thought was that the Jewish governor of Pennsylvania would be vice president. Mm-hmm. And the claim was, no, that's too many Jews. We don't want a Jew in that position. That marked a change. I think for some people that distanced them from the Democratic Party because their sense was, the Democratic Party is the party that shouldn't be asking those kinds of questions. And whether it turns out that progressives further distance from those Jewish values, more akin to what's just happened in Canada, or whether the lesson of this election will be that many of the progressives need to be marginalized, that remains to be seen. But we shouldn't let that moment, which is the first time really since the days when Abe Ribicoff felt that a Jew shouldn't be in a high position and declined, I think, a cabinet office, we shouldn't let it pass without notice that something did change in this election.
Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our guest this week, Jonathan Sarna. Identity Crisis is produced by me, Tessa Zitter, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. This episode was produced with assistance from Annie Beyer-Chaffetz and edited by Gareth Hobbs at Silversound NYC, with music provided by SoCalled. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website, typically a week after an episode airs. We're always looking for ideas for what we should cover in future episodes, so if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this episode, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.